The intermediate plateau is the most common place to hit a wall while working toward conversational fluency in a language. In the previous two videos, we talked about why students have so much trouble getting past the intermediate stage of language learning, what priorities to focus on in order to break through to the next level, and the most important study routine that you can implement for making consistent, reliable progress on the language every single day. In this video, we'll cover the remaining essential habits for getting from intermediate to advanced, based on our work with hundreds of students that we've coached for Spanish fluency. We've already described how to have a daily routine that creates a strong pattern of daily growth. Now that that daily pattern is established, it's time to work on habits that build on that and enhance it, making it as productive as possible. Ideally, as you gain knowledge day by day, you should gain more and more confidence as well, and the more that happens, the more motivated you'll be to keep learning more Spanish. This creates a feedback loop of constantly growing in knowledge and confidence, resulting in a virtuous cycle, a snowball effect. The second study habit is the one that will give you the productive material to keep that snowball growing in the exact ways you personally need it to grow. Conceptually, I like to call this the habit of turning all your weaknesses into strengths. But to be down to earth and practical, what I'm talking about is how to make the best use of your personal flashcards, generating them from the exact areas where you need to grow in your Spanish. To explain how this works, let's use an analogy. Let's say that you've begun building a shelter out of sticks, and the structure is standing, but it has some serious gaps in it. In order to strengthen it, you have a patching kit with a type of clay that hardens into a very strong patch in the structure wherever you apply it. Now imagine that you find a gaping hole in your shelter. Of course, you apply some of this clay there, and then, after the clay dries, that spot that used to be the weakest part of the structure is now one of the strongest spots. So according to this image, your structure itself is weak, but any place you patch it with the clay, it'll be very strong. That's what we're going to be doing with habit number 2, looking for the weakest spots in your Spanish abilities so that we can patch them up and turn them into the strongest spots. Maybe it sounds too good to be true, but there's actually a simple system for making this happen. But the first thing that it requires is humility. You have to admit to yourself that currently, your structure is full of holes that need to be patched up. And although we naturally want to cover up and hide our weaknesses, the best language learners are the ones who actually look for the holes and put them on display. So you actually need to commit to poking holes in that weak structure. That can be painful, but the more proactively you do this, the more quickly you'll grow into a strong, fluent Spanish speaker. The things you'll be capturing are both output weaknesses and input weaknesses. An output weakness is when you want to say or write something in Spanish, but you're not sure how. Just make a note of what you had trouble with, even in English, and save it for later so that you can work on that specific thing. An input weakness is when you don't understand something you read or can't understand what someone says. You may find this happening even more frequently than the output weaknesses, but you should be just as dedicated to trying to capture what you had trouble with so that you can study that specific thing regularly and turn it into a strength. Let's look at exactly what this means practically. Any time that you have trouble saying something, make an actual note of that. Admit to yourself, I didn't know how to say that, and then write it down, keeping the note in a place that you'll look at it later. And even more embarrassingly, perhaps, you should do this when you're listening to someone else speak as well. In a Spanish conversation, be willing to speak up and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that one phrase. Ideally, you should have a note-taking device handy so that you can write down what it is that you had trouble with. Again, this might feel embarrassing or negative, but I actually like to think of it as a positive thing. If you're upfront and specific about where you're having trouble in the language, you can turn those specific weaknesses into strengths all the faster. Of course, in-person conversations aren't the only place that you can do this. I've found that one of the best places to find weaknesses in my Spanish for quick improvements is text conversations. When you're texting, it's really easy to pause mid-conversation and make a note. Nobody notices. If you don't have friends that text you in Spanish, then I recommend the app HelloTalk. It's a free platform for doing language exchange with native speakers from around the world. Whether you're capturing your weaknesses via text or in face-to-face conversations, you shouldn't be embarrassed to ask for help. In my experience, native Spanish speakers will actually respect you for making an effort to write something down so that you can improve your conversational Spanish. Now, what do you do with all these notes of your weaknesses? As often as possible, at least a couple of times a week, but ideally every day, you should sit down, go through all of the new notes of your Spanish weaknesses, and input them as flashcards in your Quizlet system. Let's say one of your notes simply says something like, "I didn't know the Spanish word for digest yesterday." At a minimum, you can simply go to SpanishDict.com and put the English word on one side of your flashcard and the Spanish version on the other side. But when you have time, I recommend finding a good entire phrase to translate. Lingui.com is a good resource for finding sentence examples. One way or another, commit to going through all of your notes regularly and turning them into flashcards so that those weaknesses that you've captured turn into strengths. But ultimately, again, try to be hyper-aware of your weaknesses. Listen for them all day and form the habit of always capturing them whenever possible in order to turn them ultimately into strengths. That's the essence of habit number 2. The third habit is to turn Spanish media into a means of productive practice for you. This depends on the previous 2 habits already being established. Assuming that you now have your daily study routine described in the previous video, and that you're effectively capturing your weaknesses and systematically turning them into strengths with your spaced repetition flashcards, you can now be confident that whatever you put there will turn into long-term Spanish skills. So the third of our 5 habits is to find Spanish sources that are just outside your comfort zone that are going to provide more and more words and phrases for you to capture. Let's break this down. First of all, you should find media sources that are just outside your comfort zone. Let's imagine you have a student whose current reading level is Eric Carle. You wouldn't have this student jump straight from there to Tolstoy. Don't go so far beyond your current comfort zone that you get completely lost and discouraged. What we'll look for here is media that it would take only a little extra study for you to understand. Second, remember that you need to be committed to capturing your weaknesses, meaning that you'll take note of the things that you previously didn't know and add them to your flashcard set. You won't just notice when there's a new word or phrase that you didn't know. You'll make a note of it and you'll make sure that it goes into your system. Whenever you're choosing Spanish media, the best sources are forms of media with both audio and a transcript. Songs are great because you can almost always find accurate lyrics online. Videos and movies are good only when there are accurate subtitles, which is unfortunately much rarer than it should be. Personally, my favorite tool is books in Spanish, combining both a physical copy and an audiobook. That way I can read and listen at the same time, and I can choose a subject that's interesting to me, from fiction to history to science. It's important to note that what we're doing with media here is not passive entertainment. In fact, if you're using Spanish media effectively for study, it will unfortunately probably not be very entertaining, so to speak, for a while. The process that I recommend is first reading through a paragraph or so, or maybe the first verse of a song, and noting and looking up any words that are not familiar to you yet. Then, once you've learned them, read through it again, this time with the audio playing, and see if your comprehension is now at 100%. If it's not yet, then study a little bit more. Once you're able to understand it perfectly while reading and listening simultaneously, you can then try listening without reading along. And if you're now at 100% comprehension, you've made a very satisfying step forward. Then move to the next passage. But meanwhile, make sure that the things that you had to look up get into your personal flashcard system. Include entire phrases of up to 10 words or so. But be strategic about it too. If a phrase had only one word that you didn't know, that makes for a good single flashcard, that one phrase. But let's say you're reading something fairly dense that had 2 terms that are unfamiliar to you. Personally, I think that this merits 2 or 3 flashcards, perhaps one for each of the words by itself, and then one with the entire phrase. For example, I was reading the first chapter of Sapiens in Spanish and encountered the phrase proportional to their wingspan. This is phrased in Spanish as proporcional a su envergadura alar. In this case, since envergadura alar is a mouthful, I decided to make this its own flashcard, and then I also made a separate flashcard with the entire phrase to practice it in context. Spanish media is one of the best resources for finding entire phrases to practice, because once you've learned the phrase, it's often catchy and sticks in your mind. I ended up continually having phrases from the first chapter of Sapiens keep popping into my mind, even at random moments while not working on Spanish, for weeks afterwards. Spanish songs are even better for this because you can easily get lines of Spanish songs stuck in your head, which becomes an automatic way of reviewing those phrases in addition to your faithful daily quizzing that you should be doing. The fourth habit is sort of the goal of all of this. Conversation practice, but specifically you should be getting productive conversation practice that's focused on improving your current capabilities in Spanish just at the edge of your comfort zone. There are two things to remember when it comes to conversation practice aimed at getting you to fluency. First of all, this is focused, devoted practice time where you should be 100% focused on improving your conversational skills and finding places to poke holes in your Spanish abilities in order to get better. There are many ways to practice conversational Spanish, and you should take advantage of as many of them as you reasonably can, including just free conversation with native speakers in your life or people you meet for fun. But if you're serious about getting to the next level in your fluency, it's important to spend at least some time working on the type of conversation practice that's specifically tailored towards sharpening your current skills. This means working with someone who's truly dedicated to speaking roughly at your level and working on your problem areas proactively to get you to the next level. If you're not sure where to find native speakers who can dedicate themselves to this, our accelerated Spanish coaches are some of the best in the world. Second, during the time that you practice, make sure to capture your weaknesses, including anything that you have trouble saying and anything that you have trouble understanding. Remember the analogy from earlier in this video during habit number 2 where I talked about building a flimsy shelter. You're currently at a point in your Spanish journey where you should be trying to turn all of those weaknesses into strengths. Conversation practice is perhaps the best format for finding where your weaknesses are. And if you have a high level of trust with the person that you're practicing with, they'll be supportive of you making notes during your practice sessions so that you can capture the specific things you're needing to improve. Finding your own weaknesses doesn't consist only of noting where you're missing some vocabulary here or there. It's also being willing to take note of any grammatical errors you make and correcting them. It's best if you have a trusting agreement with the person you practice with and agree to have them correct all of your mistakes so that you then say the things the right way. For example, if you're conversing and accidentally say, he visto el persona, instead of he visto a la persona, your conversation partner will correct you and tell you the right way to say it. And the expectation is that you will then repeat the sentence that you were trying to say, but this time you'll say it with he visto a la persona, the correct phrase. Practice must be not simply speaking Spanish, but speaking correct Spanish. I had a student once who had been practicing Spanish for years without being corrected before she joined our program, and she was in the unfortunate habit of using ser instead of estar all the time. For example, she'd been saying the incorrect phrase ¿dónde es instead of ¿dónde está for years without anyone telling her it was wrong. So now it was a fixed part of her Spanish voice. Unfortunately, this made it very difficult for her to communicate well with native speakers who frequently misunderstood her or just couldn't tell what she was trying to say, and the habit took a long time for her to fix. If she had simply been speaking correctly from the beginning, these wrong habits would not have been so deeply ingrained. You want to be told about your mistakes as soon as you make them, at least during a regular time specifically devoted to this. Ultimately, habit number 4 is about having dedicated practice time where it's agreed that you will say things correctly. If you say something wrong, that's fine, but when you're told that it was wrong, accept the correction, thank the native speaker for correcting you, and then say it the right way so that the correct Spanish becomes ingrained in your Spanish voice. Habit 5 is about getting used to switching between English and Spanish. To explain why this is important, I'm going to describe a very common scenario. Imagine that you've been studying Spanish for about 6 months, and you now have a daily Spanish routine that lasts about 2 hours every morning. During that time, you're completely in the zone for working on this language. It's always productive, and you're very pleased with your progress, including designated times each week for speaking with a native-speaking Spanish coach who helps you get more and more advanced in your conversation skills. But then one day, while you're out at a party, a friend introduces you to a new acquaintance, bragging to her that you're learning Spanish. And your friend says, "You guys should speak Spanish." Immediately, this unannounced stranger suddenly starts rattling off Spanish to you. Now, you weren't expecting to speak Spanish this evening at all, and you're nowhere near the homely comfort of your daily routine. So suddenly, here you are, and you're completely lost in trying to understand what this person is saying. Then you try to express something to her in response, but you flounder. What went wrong? The thing is, you've been practicing Spanish inside a familiar environment, and that's been very good for you. But now it's time to start taking Spanish outside of that zone, and that's what the 5th habit is going to be all about. Even outside of your morning routine, the Spanish media you enjoy, and your dedicated Spanish conversation practice, you should practice switching to Spanish suddenly, no matter where you are. In the real world, you need to be ready to join or start a Spanish conversation at an unexpected moment. Getting better and better while you're quizzing or while you're doing any other type of normal homework might end up getting you close to perfect on your flashcards or on your written assignments specifically, but only in that familiar context. Incidentally, this is one reason that so many of us have mastered a game-based language app, but then freeze up when encountering Spanish in a different context. So let's find some ways to make sure that your Spanish is transferring between contexts. Now, this habit is a bit trickier than the previous 4. It's not something that you'll do at a regular time every day or every week. Instead, this is about finding creative ways to introduce Spanish spontaneously, maybe even randomly, into your life through various contexts. The goal is to become adept at switching quickly into Spanish anytime you need to. So let's talk about some strategies for doing this. First of all, you don't want to stress yourself out constantly about switching to Spanish at every moment of the day. We're not trying to have Spanish constantly disrupt activities that you should be focused on, and you don't want it to be a cause of nonstop stress. So instead of it being constant, think of ways to have it come up just somewhat randomly a few times a day. One idea is to set a gentle timer on your phone to buzz every 1 hour and 10 minutes, or some odd interval like that. And then whenever this goes off, quickly see if you can translate whatever you were doing in that moment into a few Spanish sentences. Then you can put that away, and you can spend the next hour and 10 minutes not having to think about Spanish at all. This simulates what it's like to have to use Spanish unexpectedly, but not constantly. And the nice thing about this strategy is that you don't have to be constantly thinking about whether or not you should be ready right now to switch into Spanish. When the timer goes off, see if you can gently switch for a moment or two. Then go back to whatever you were doing and don't worry about it anymore. Another great way to see Spanish spontaneously appear in your life outside of your normal Spanish study is to use a free tool that Accelerated Spanish has running on our Instagram account. These are spontaneous Spanish challenges that are new every day, so you know you've never seen them before. If you use Instagram, just follow @AcceleratedSpanish and then make sure to watch your Instagram story. What will happen is while you're watching your Instagram story each day, you'll spontaneously be interrupted by Accelerated Spanish asking you to perform a small random Spanish challenge. An English sentence will appear, usually a very off-the-wall one like this one, and your task is to see how quickly you can come up with the Spanish equivalent. The next item will show the Spanish so that you can check and see if you were correct. This roughly simulates what it's like to have to come up with a Spanish sentence spontaneously in a random moment. And we create brand new examples every single day, so it'll always be a fresh new challenge for you. If you work on spontaneous switching like this, Over time, you'll be more and more comfortable with the idea of switching to Spanish during a random encounter with a Spanish speaker. This is a huge step toward true bilingualism. Let's wrap up. If you follow these 5 study habits faithfully, you'll never have to worry or wonder about your progress toward fluency. That intermediate plateau will no longer be a plateau. It'll be a distinct tilt, a gradual incline that you're moving up every day, and you'll be able to feel your daily progress. Your daily routine will keep your Spanish knowledge strong and growing, and the amount of speaking out loud that you end up doing by following these habits is going to increase your confidence very quickly. This constantly increasing knowledge, combined with your steadily growing confidence, will create a snowball effect of momentum to propel you toward fluency. To wrap up, I recommend that you make yourself this promise. You're going to make daily Spanish progress no matter what. Specifically, each morning you'll spend at least 20 minutes doing the routine that I outlined in the previous video, no matter how busy or crazy your day is. If you just follow habit number 1 consistently, you will keep moving forward. To hold yourself to this promise, I've provided a daily habit tracker in the description of this video that you can download and print off. Use it to make sure that you're covering your bases every day, even if it's just 20 minutes some days. Click subscribe for more ideas on how to break through the intermediate plateau and get better at your conversational Spanish every day, working toward advanced fluency. Then make sure to check out these other videos on how to get the most out of your Quizlet flashcards and on how to use Instagram to quiz yourself with new Spanish challenges every day.